Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Wow. Well, it's wonderful to be here this morning. The energy is fabulous. I have been to all of your school districts and several of the schools that are represented here today. As superintendent, I was privileged to visit all 58 counties. So I've been to Loyalton and Likely and Hayfork, as well as San Bernardino and Los Angeles. I've never met a child that didn't lift me up. It's the grown-ups I worry about sometimes, but not this morning. And certainly, I want to give a shout out to Sunny McPeak and her amazing team who are doing this really important work. You know, we are living in a time where people are somewhat feckless about this issue of education. I mean, I won't say anything disparaging about our Secretary of Education, who I think if she had shown up for a job interview at either a nonprofit like United Way or at a corporation like AT&T, and she knew as little about the enterprise she was suggesting she should lead, she would have been laughed out of the room. So what we have to do, though, is we have to be more certain than ever before that we are standing for and with the children. And then we have got to stay together. We cannot let education divide itself anymore. It can't be about the preschool versus K-12, and it can't be about K-12 versus higher ed, and it can't be the community colleges fighting against CSU or UC. I like to say if I gave you 28 pencils one at a time, virtually everybody in this room could break them. But the strongest person in this room cannot break 28 pencils if we put them together. It's just too hard. So we've got to stand together for education, for all the children. And there's a lot of important work that's being done, but nothing is more important than this conversation about closing the achievement gap and the digital divide. Because that needs to become job one in California. We cannot have these kids in 1950s classroom settings. That isn't who we are. We can do better than that. The global economy has fundamentally changed the importance of education. It's always been important. Those people coming out of a civil war decided to do an amazing thing. They decided to have compulsory public education. One of the first countries on earth to say that we should educate all of the children. And it was a little sketchy in the beginning, but it was life-changing. And when you think about the information age and globalization, it has not only changed the requirements for an individual's career, it has raised the educational requirement for successful school districts, successful counties, and successful states like California. We have got to be clear that I spent a wonderful day yesterday at Curtis here in San Bernardino County. So Curtis Middle School, wow. What a great day it was. And here, what did I find there? I found a great principal. And I have to say that Marlene Bayakondova, I wish she was here today. She's not here, is she? Did I miss her? She's a rock star. And honestly, she and her teachers and her staff and her students were all together. They were all on the same page for STEM education. And they were excited and unified. And they were positive and they were optimistic. And so what a great day for me. And I will just tell you that as we are going around the state, we have got to do more building schools like Curtis and like the schools that you represent here. I've been to some of the other schools, Crozier. I was at Crozier last year, and I've really had an opportunity to be uplifted by all of you. But I'll also tell you, I do read the TIM study. You know, TIM stands for Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. And you know what they found? They found in the highest performing nations, and they were diverse, from Finland to Singapore. Very different parts of the world, very different approaches, and yet similar approaches in the sense that high-performing countries have coherence. Everybody's on the same page. Everybody's on a team together, working for the future of those kids. Singapore is a fascinating example because they turned their education program around in one generation. And we can do that again. The reality is, when we talk about world-class standards, I want to just say, there's nothing wrong with having standards for our kids. That's not evil. Every major corporate company in the world has its own internal standards. Every major country has education standards. The problem is they can't be just about memorization. This is not about memorization. This is about using information. And so at the end of the day, we have to make sure that the highest performing countries which understand this include the United States. It is not about multiple choice exams to effectively measure performance, but demonstrated ability to think and write and analyze, work in groups, find defects. And that's what I saw at Curtis. Kids are looking to find what works, what doesn't work, and to build on their knowledge about STEM to actually do productive, performance. I will just tell you, and the other thing that we need to notice, and by the way, you should know that in the TIMSS study, there is a group of California and American kids that's above average in the world. We're below average overall, but there's a group of kids that are above average, and that's the public schools with less than 10%, with at least 10%, but less than 50% of students eligible for free and reduced lunch. It is the schools that have over 75% kids on free and reduced lunch that are below average on the TIMSS study. And that is what we must focus on like a laser. Let me just tell you all, I know local control funding formula has given us some additional options at our lower performing schools, but it is simply not enough. The state is fundamentally underinvested in all schools. We are in the bottom 10 of the 50 states in per pupil spending and the top 10 of the 50 states in per prisoner expenditure. And ladies and gentlemen, budgets are statements of values. That is not the value that I know any American who holds. Even the correctional peace officers I've met don't think it's a good idea that we would starve schools. Because they know the best crime prevention program is a good education. And the economists know the best economic development program is a good education. And everyone else who does important work knows the best way we can advance this state and this society and these children is to focus on their education. So I want to just say that in the highest performing countries, what we know is teachers feel valued. And I want to just give a shout out to every teacher in this room because you are teacher leaders. And for too long, we have not lifted up the teachers of California. If I hear somebody else complain about the teachers, I'm going to pull my hair out. You know our teachers have the largest class size in the United States of America. Did you know we have not only the highest number of poor children, but the highest percentage of poor children? A quarter of a century ago, only 1 in 10 children was in the poverty level. Now it is 25%. So the fact that we have more poor children than anyone else in numbers and in percentage means we should be investing more in education, not only for the poor children, but for every child, because we cannot allow this to become a contest where we're playing off each other. So I'm for LCFF, but it is fundamentally underfunded, and so is the rest of education, and somebody needs to wake up and smell the coffee and reinvest in education. Go look at the state constitution, Article 16, Section 8. These people take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the state of California and the Constitution of the United States. You know what Article 16, Section 8 says? From all revenues, the state shall first set aside the money for the education of children through institutions of higher education. But as much as it's important that we have great teachers, it's really important that we have great principals. Principals have to be instructional leaders who are empowered to focus on instruction every minute of every day. You know, the truth is, when I first went to the National Institute of School Leadership, we were in Jacksonville, Florida, and Florida's different than California in the sense that they only have as many districts as they have counties. Every county is a district. Now that seems weird in California because our counties have so many people in them. Like, remember there are, as Sonny pointed out, there are more students in LA Unified than there are people in North Dakota. I know you spent a year there one night, but seriously, we don't realize the scale of California. One time the Wyoming superintendent said, "Oh my God, Delaine, you're so lucky that you're not growing. I think all of your kids are moving out of California and they're moving to Wyoming. We're just adding kids in leaps and bounds." And I said, well, Judy, and Judy Catchpole, she was actually a really nice person. And I said, well, Judy, we are losing some students, but we're gaining some students too. So what's happening is our rate of growth isn't as large as it used to be, but we're still adding students. And she said, oh, how many did you add last year? I said, well, last year, it was 86,000. The year before it was 110,000. The year before that was 140,000 because we did class size reduction in K3, and a lot of people that would have put their kids in private schools or in other kinds of situations put them in public schools. She said, oh my God, 140,000, where did you put them? Her whole state had 86,000 students in it, which was the number we added that year. So when you think about the scale of California, we really do need great principals to help our great teachers. And the fact is, principals need to build organizational systems in which everyone at the school site takes ownership. Great principals focus on educational leadership. And that's what I saw at Curtis and at Crozier and at the other schools that I have visited that are here today. The truth is, I visited over 600 schools in the state of California as superintendent. I never went to a great school that didn't have a great principal. And I never went to a great school district that didn't have a great superintendent. But that means they are focused on instruction. So when we went to Florida and we had 60-something principals that were going to go through the National Institute for School Leadership Training, and we asked them to keep track of their time during the week. And they knew we were focused on instructional leadership. We asked them to keep track of where they spent their time. There was only one principal who spent over 15% of her time on instructional leadership. The rest were worried about discipline and site maintenance and a bunch of things that are really not job one. So here's one of the things I learned in the private sector. They had us do a exercise. Take everything in your inbox, put it in an A pile, the most important, a B pile, somewhat important, a C pile, the least important. Then go through your B pile and decide, is it really an A, really important, or really a C, unimportant? Then throw out your C pile, because that's the one you'll be tempted to do every time. Because it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the stuff I'm going to get out of the way before I get to my A pile. But you've got to get to your A pile, because that's really where the substantive work is. That's where job one is. So I will tell you that too often in America, principals do not have or do not feel they have control. I think that the fact that you are here today, that you're able to work in partnership with each other across schools, across districts, with your staffs and with your district office staff is really important, because highly effective principals like leaders in the military and leaders in successful businesses have the authority to take responsibility. And authority is something that principals must feel that they are in control and that there is a sense of teamwork and purpose at the site. And I'll be honest with you, for too long, federal and state accountability systems have suggested that we really hold these principals as responsible for student outcomes. But principals frequently say they are not empowered to focus on student outcomes. That's why this framework that you are working with of school to home is important, because it does give you a much better way to focus on high expectations for children. You know, the old saying, it's better to set your sights too high and miss them than set them too low and hit them. We've got to have high expectations for these children. But too often principals tell me they lack financial resources. What I loved at Curtis was they actually were getting part of the LCFF money to do their STEM education, to buy the equipment that allowed these kids to move forward. Too often principals tell me there are low expectations for students. Well, you really can't expect much. These kids are in poverty. Well, you know, guess what? There's a lot of kids that came out of poverty, and some of them are sitting in this room who got great educations and then have had wonderful lives. You're talking to the machinist's daughter here. Dress clerk was my mother. And I had a great education, and I've had a wonderful life. So I will just tell you, we have to make sure, though, that principals feel that their faculty has the capability, and they do. It's just that too often they're not treated like they're members of a team. What is the word teachers often use to identify their situation? It's isolation. So that's why it's important that you learn to work together as members of the same team. And of course, principals complain they have lack of authority to get the job done and not enough time to be instructional leaders. So we need a strategy for developing the kind of coherence that is found in the most high-performing countries. And we need a new generation of school leaders who will, in fact, believe everything is possible, and that will, in fact, look like this room. Because there's a diversity in this room, you notice? And that's California. That's who we are. In the end of the day, whether it's a high-performing state like Connecticut or a high-performing country like Singapore or Finland, we need to have a capacity-building model. And in my view, that's part of the reason you are here today, because you have things to teach each other and to share with one another. I have to say that changes occurred in business management. All the jobs were moving offshore, and business looked around in the 80s and they said, wow, a lot of jobs are leaving America. What are we going to do? And so there was a sea change that occurred in American business, and they did in fact change their business schools, because a lot of corporations were starting to use their executives to train people. So the business schools changed, and now guess what? Schools of education are changing. When I was superintendent, I begged UC to either fish or cut bait, either offer EDDs for people that didn't want to be professors but wanted to be school leaders like principals and like superintendents, or let the state university system do it. Too many of the University of California campuses essentially told me, I actually was invited by a wonderful guy who was chancellor at Riverside. He invited me to come down and talk to his School of Education. And I went in there, and it was I have to tell you, it was mostly white men. And I told them I really needed an EDD program so that we could train a new generation of principals and superintendents about leadership for the future. And I needed not just the PhD, that was important, but I needed the EDD. You should have seen the body language in the room. Almost all white men. And I had the chancellor of Riverside, UC Riverside, with me, and I had the head of the School of Education, who I'd known, he'd been at Stanford, worked with me. So I was thrilled. I have the chancellor, and I have the dean of the school, and I have a bunch of people with their arms crossed, looking resistant. And so, I said, so we need to have evening classes, and we need to have Saturday classes, because we have working professionals who are in the classrooms and or working as assistant principals, but they need more scaffolding to help them learn. And one of the professors said, let me see if I understand this. You want us to bring a bunch of 30-something, 40-something, or God forbid, 50-something-year-old students into our school and work on the evenings and weekends? No, we want a bunch of 20-somethings that want to be professors just like us. Well, guess what? That changed. Mills College, where I worked, that was one of the reasons I was invited. They were one of the first to do an EDD, and they did it in evenings and weekends. And a bunch of other a bunch of other professors, and it convinced their schools of education, because there were also some county offices like Sac County that started offering MAs and PhDs in education, or EDDs in education, because they had people that didn't want to commute far distances but wanted to get the training they needed to be school leaders. So I have to tell you that I think we have to take the time to learn to work as a team. And that's really what this is about. But it's also the time to learn from other teams that are represented here today. But we have to develop a sense of urgency about what we are doing. Time is a wasting. And the absolute importance of school leaders cannot be diminished any longer. We have to have people leading these schools, in fact, leading these educational teams, who are building and maintaining a standards-based instructional system, but one that's nimble, that's interesting, that's exciting, that the kids really want to do. These kids were on fire to do science, technology, engineering, mathematics. You know them. They want to be they want to be doctors. They want to be professors. They want to be educators. They want to be the future. But they have to have us believing in them and creating a learning environment so that teachers are supported in providing the type of instructional leadership that demands excellence in literacy, yes, but also in mathematics, in the arts. 25% of the jobs in the new economy are based in art. We need to understand that this is not. And by the way, when I had my arts task force, I like to keep them under 20. I did an arts task force. I had all these people demanding they be on the task force. It wasn't just the museums and the artists and the art galleries and the university art departments, music departments. It was Silicon Valley, because the software industry needs artists. It was the motion picture industry, because they need kids steeped in the arts. This is not crazy. This is absolutely who we're going to be in the future. In fact, the number is probably over 25%. So one of the things we know is that we have to design a learning environment such that teachers are supported in providing the kind of instructional leadership that does provide this kind of scaffolding. And beyond that, we have to begin to say that we're going to give principals more authority over the budget, over the staffing, over what they do and how they do it. Because I will tell you right now, and I want to tell you, nobody is more important to me than great teachers. I always say there's no job in America that's more important than that of a teacher. But it's also important to have wonderful principals. And right now we have a shortage in both. There is a terrible, terrible teacher shortage. And why? Well, I think the slogan that should be applied here is the floggings will continue until morale improves. We have belittled teachers and we have belittled principals for so long and limited their ability to make the decisions and move the needle, and then we're wondering why nobody wants to do this job. Well, guess what? This is the most important work we could be doing. It's every bit as important as any corporation, and it's every bit as important as any general or admiral you've ever met. So I'm here to tell you, our goal has to be, though, to change the training model for principals, to incorporate the best practices of other entities. And that is why it's important that you have taken the time to be here today, to share with each other, to learn from each other, to talk to each other, and to be thinking about what you do when you go home in this cloudy, rainy month of February to inspire and uplift those who you work with to move the ball for us. Because I will also say, I really do believe we have to move out of the bottom 10 of the 50 states in per pupil investment. If Prop 55 hadn't passed, we might have dropped back to 50th when the Prop 30 money ran out. So we have a window, but we have to stop the people in Sacramento from doing the shell game, because they have intentionally moved money out of the Prop 98 guarantee. They have excuses, it's a shell game. 1 minute they're taking out child development, and then they lower the amount of money in child development, then they put it back in the Prop 98 guarantee, so it pulls down the number. And we have other, Jerry Brown said he was going to restore the money he'd taken out of child development. $1 billion was taken, and we were supposed to get $230 million back this year, and it's the 0 to 5 kids that need it the most. That's the steepest curve of learning in your life. So for us to say, we're taking $230 million, we'll still owe it to you, but we're going to defer paying you. So what do you say to the 4-year-old? Would you please defer development for a year? No, they don't defer. They just don't develop as well as they would have if we had given them that opportunity. It is a shame and a disgrace that we are not supporting preschool, child development, and K-12. And by the way, kindergarten should be mandatory, and it should be full day. It's outrageous that it is not. But I want to just say, we do need, in fact, to have a model for school districts that play a major role in determining who will be our leaders and what leadership training they will work on and what are the major action projects. And ideally, districts will provide faculty with mentors. And that's why it's important that you're here at School to Home. Because this is an opportunity, yes, for you to share, but for you to think about what we can do in the future to make sure that we've got the tools in your toolbox to get things done. And so you're incorporating technology into teaching and learning with the substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition model. I'm not going to speak about it because we have an expert that's going to speak about it. But the fact is that and I know it is a challenge at many of your schools because many of your parents do not speak English. And they don't just speak one other language. I was at a school in Fremont where there were 13 languages spoken. The teacher was trilingual, but she still had 10 kids she couldn't speak to because they were in that room and she didn't have their language. And so we have to say, we're going to create a culture that does, in fact, foster optimism, because optimism is critical to success. You got to believe if you're going to do this. You got to believe. I saw the sign in one of the neighboring rooms. You know the story, the Mets? Were ahead. They were supposed to be in last place. Everybody picked them to finish last. And after the 4th of July, they were still in first place. And they went back into the locker room, and there was dead silence. They'd come from like 8-0 behind, and they won the game. And the second baseman looked up and said, you got to believe. And that became the slogan of that entire city. And what happened? You got to believe. The Mets went on to win the World Series, of course. And so at the end of the day, part of it is making sure that the principal is the architect of a culture of success, a culture that is results-oriented, yes, but also that's ethical, that says to each child, we're going to do this We're going to do this together. The first message of leadership is really, none of us is as smart as all of us. There is an American myth that the triumphant individual is the secret to success. We tend to confuse leadership with heroism. But real leadership is not an individual phenomenon. Real leadership and sustainable change is about growing cooperation and collaboration. Bennis and Biederman have a wonderful book called Organizing Genius, and this is what they say, quote, "We have to recognize a new paradigm, not great leaders alone, but great leaders who exist in a fertile relationship with a great group. In these creative alliances, the leader and the team are able to achieve something together that neither could achieve alone. The leader finds greatness in the group, and he or she helps the members to find themselves." That's leadership. So while greatness starts with great people, in a sense, great groups and great leaders create each other. The command and control style really doesn't work. Yes, the leaders of successful organizations must act decisively, but never arbitrarily. That is why it is important to create an atmosphere where others on your team are empowered. They can and must influence the change that is needed. While we need a strong leader, he or she is more of a steward than a straw boss, keeping the others focused, minimizing distractions, and keeping optimism alive, even in the face of defeats or stumbles or setbacks. And then you've heard several setbacks here, but you kept at it. You kept getting the Chromebooks. You kept getting them into the hands of your students. This is what Bennis and Biederman have to say, quote, "The leaders of great group love talent and know where to find it. Great groups are headed by people confident enough to recruit people better than themselves. They revel in the talent of others. But they also must be certain that these talented people can work together," end quote. This means that while greatness starts with great people, it is in a sense great groups and great leaders that create one another. Your team, you as a principal, are as great as your team is, as you know, in the game. You've all seen the great quarterback that lost all of his games, or most of his games, because the team didn't work together. And so, in fact, the command and control style doesn't work in schools. Yes, some organizations have acted decisively, but never arbitrarily, and that's the thing to remember. Leaders who lead for sustainability must be believers that they are doing something vital, even holy. Because you are, really. You must be prepared to recruit people for crusades, not just jobs. Because some of our most challenged and challenging students are among the most gifted. That is why sustainable change requires optimism. You can build safety nets and scaffolding that will help not just the poorest kids in our community, but those children who are functioning in less than optimal family circumstances. And I've probably said this every time I've spoken here, but I will say to you, if you are not from a dysfunctional family, I'll bet you married someone from a dysfunctional family, or your best friend was from a dysfunctional family. Me, I'm a triple dipper. And it was those teachers who helped me to make it in this world, who helped me to be who I am today when things were not going so well. So we can build safety nets and scaffolding that will help not just the poorest children in our community, but the children who have dysfunctional families, who may be very middle class, but in fact have craziness happening. Leadership in a culture of change is not something that is innately understood by all educators. We must have a curriculum that supports the education of educators to lead the sea change that is going to be required in the future. Yes, we need to understand management, but even more important, we have to understand leadership. The other quandary is, as I mentioned before, we're entering a period where a new generation of leaders is required. A lot of principals are retiring, but too few want the job in the future. We've got to make sure that they feel empowered. And we must acknowledge that schools overall are underfunded in California and make more resources available. It's ridiculous that we have such large class sizes. You know, I'm in a blue-collar household in blue-collar community at the time in the 50s, and I went from a classroom, admittedly, in San Francisco of 44. My parents bought the littler house that cost more. They got less square footage and for more money because the school district was better. I was the 20th kid at Britton Acres Elementary School in San Carlos, California. So class size does matter, and we have to do a lot more to support what you're doing. And I will tell you that the networking offered by School to Home is important for principals, because in too many districts, they don't have that scaffolding. So I'm a believer that budgets are statements of values. If you looked at the budget of California, you'd think prisons were more important than schools. That is unacceptable to me, and I hope it is to you. But we all have to get busy here. We got work to do. And we can do this. And it's if the people coming out of a depression and war could do it, then we can do it. I like to remind people that John Kennedy loved to tell the story of an old French admiral who had retired, and he went home to his chateau, and he got the gardener to come with him, and he told him he wanted to plant these perennials and these annuals and certain shrubs, and then he started in on the trees he wanted him to add. And the gardener stopped him and said, "Sir, I really and truly have not said anything. I'm not objecting to anything except that last tree that you mentioned. It's very slow growing. It will give you no shade in your lifetime in all probability." And the old French admiral thought for a minute and said, "In that case, plant it this afternoon." And when I was sworn in at Britton Acres Elementary School as state superintendent, you know, most people go to the state library or the state capitol or the Secretary of State's building. I went to Britton Acres Elementary School in San Carlos, California to be sworn in. And I told the story about this beautiful stand of redwoods at the back of the upper playground that had been just spindly little redwoods when I was a kid, and now there's this magnificent grove. And I said, you know, I'm sure that the principal had that vision. Well, it turns out the principal, Ralph Howitt, was sitting in the audience. He had seen I was going to be sworn in at Britton Acres. He was a retired man in his 70s, and he came down, and he sat in the audience, and afterward he came up and introduced himself. And he said, "You know, Delaine, they didn't make fun of me for the stand of redwoods, probably because it was the back of the upper playground, and most of them didn't notice it. They made fun of me for that spindly little oak tree I planted in the front lawn. If you ever drive by Britton Acres, go look at that oak tree. It's magnificent." And I will just tell you that I think when we think about who we are and where we're going, the time has come for us to understand, yes, real substantive reform takes time. We need the time to plan. We need the time to train. We need the time to implement. We need time to evaluate and correct, and the time to make certain that the laws are upheld, yes, but we need to get going right away. At the same time, we must commit ourselves to preparing every child in America to be a participant in the global economy as well as the American dream. The defense of America has more to do with the education of our children than building an anti-missile system, or putting a person on Mars, or building a wall between America and Mexico, or banning people from certain countries from entering our country. The defense of this country is now and always has been about having a well-educated population that dreams of a better life for themselves and perhaps most of all for their children. Today in America, most low-wage workers never move into the middle class. According to a study by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the economies of France, Italy, Britain, Germany, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden provide more mobility for low-wage workers than the United States. What do they have in common? They have great educational systems. Some of the angriest protests of the president's ill-considered immigration limitations are actually corporations in the Silicon Valley who rely on the immigration of highly skilled workers. If you actually wanted to limit immigration ethically, then let the magic of the marketplace work for American children. And tomorrow, instead of relying on imported workers, we should have American kids that we've educated and trained and given technology and the opportunity to think and work together and learn. We should allow those kids to take the high-tech jobs of the future. If America in general, and California in particular, recommitted itself to excellence in education, we might trim immigration in our nation the old-fashioned way by preparing American workers to take these jobs, to be America's workforce in the years to come. But beyond strengthening our economy and our family structure, education pays so many other benefits. In the final analysis, our best hope for social competence as well as for economic success and the prevalence of democratic values is to improve the education of our children. That's all of our children. My thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here, to improve your leadership skills, to take the opportunity to share and educate others and to be educated by them, as well as for believing that school to home and the various digital divide accommodations that we're making to make sure every kid is in contact, the achievement gap that you're closing, all of these things are important. I always use the Neil Postman quote, "Children are a living message we send to a time we will never see." I thank Anu for her lovely introduction, but I never forget that. And for those of you who've lived in a time that your parents did not live to see, you come to a special understanding that you were sent here by them to do important work, and that you must carry their message into the future. And so what is our message to the future? Well, I have hope as I look into the eyes of the people in this room that it's a good one. In fact, I have something more than hope. I have optimism. In his wonderful book, Martin Seligman's Learned Optimism, he writes, "We used to think that success in this world was a combination of talent and hard work. But it turns out there are talented, hardworking people who don't succeed. What are they lacking? They're lacking optimism." I've seen optimism. I met a little girl at a school in San Diego who looked me in the eye and told me when she grew up she was going to be a marine biologist. She was a skinny little girl who was living in the car, because it was a school for homeless children. She was living in the car with her family. But there were other children in that room who were also homeless, who were going to be doctors, lawyers. And if we have optimism about it, and you do what you're doing, you're going to see a bunch of your students come back to you in years to come and say, "Today I'm a doctor. Today I'm a lawyer. Today I'm a teacher because of you." I will just tell you that we need to have this optimism, and if you start getting sketchy about the optimism, then get yourself out to a school, because the kids have it. They believe in us, and they believe in their future. We just have to make sure that we give them hope and optimism about our ability to do this. So as the poet said, "Let us now be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait." I know you are laboring. I know sometimes you have to wait, but what you are doing is life-changing. I thank you for being on this mission. Glad to be with you. Glad to be together.